Okay, I would like to welcome everybody to the fall semester uh, midterm briefings. We are at the halfway point in our management simulation of some of the most interesting environmental bills I've ever seen, and in an era when it actually appears as if some of them might be enacted. And so this is an important moment. We are also halfway through this master's program in about a week. And so you just arrived, and very soon you'll be graduating. And so it really does happen very quickly, and hopefully the learning is going on and people are happy with what they've learned. I'm very happy with what I'm seeing so far. The products of this workshop that I've experienced and heard and read are spectacular, and I'm very impressed. The midterm briefings are devoted to the issue of what should we do. In other words, you get a bill, and the bill is big and vague, and you've got to bring it down to what we call a program design. So the first half of our semester is getting to the point where we answer the what question. What do we do? The second half of the semester is devoted to the issue of how do we do it. And so that's what will be going on through the second half of the semester. And when you manage a program, management is tricky. It's a craft. It's hard to figure out. And once we figure out what we're going to do, the second half of the semester will be who's going to do the work, how much is it going to cost, how are we going to know what's happening, and what can we do in our first year. And so that's really what's going to happen throughout the second half of the semester. And we are going to begin with our first briefer talking about the San Francisco Bay Restoration Act of 2021. And I believe Aaron Zweig is our briefer. Please come forward.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to our midterm briefing on our work this far on Bill H.R. 610, otherwise known as the San Francisco Restoration Act. I'd like to just take a moment to thank my task team, Alina, Carolyn, and Amir, as well as my team at large. I'd also love to just give a special thank you to our advisor, Lloyd Cass, for his guidance on the project thus far. Let's dive in. So for the agenda today, let's start off with the San Francisco Bay and the current problems taking place, the bill itself, and how it plans to tackle the problems, the bill's components, the various stakeholders involved, our program design that will generate the best expected restoration outcomes, and finally, the upcoming tasks necessary to implement our program. So before we even really begin, let's recap why the San Francisco Bay is so important. It's the fourth largest economy in the US and is a hub for technological, financial, industrial, and agricultural activity, among other sectors. Its environmental makeup provides a home to thousands of animals and plants, some of which are only found in the Bay. Because of the critical role it plays for humans, animals, and plants, it has been classified as a wetland of international importance. But while the Bay provides almost innumerable benefits, it has suffered over the last century. Urban sprawl, resource extraction, and industrial activity have caused habitat degradation and an increase in invasive species, placing native species at risk. In fact, over the last century, the San Francisco Bay has lost close to 90% of its wetlands. Further pollutants and eutrophication have decreased the Bay's water quality, harmed marine life, and negatively impacted food chains at large. And then there's climate change, which puts additional stress on an already impacted environment. For instance, rising sea levels put human populations at risk, damage wildlife habitats, and increase the presence of pollutants in the water, as inundation of shoreline industrial activity drags harmful chemicals into the bay. These issues often compound off one another, damaging the environmental and economic prosperity of the bay. And so, the San Francisco Restoration Act was created. The bill's intent, taken directly from the document itself, is to amend the Federal Water Pollution Control Act to establish a grant program to support the restoration of San Francisco Bay. Its objective is to drive equitable economic growth and to create a resilient bay overall. The bill outlines 4 sub-goals to restore the bay: improving water quality, wetland restoration, native species recovery, and ensuring the bay can adapt to increasing levels of climate change. Now, there are certain mandatory components to this bill. First, the bill requires a San Francisco Restoration Office, along with a director, to be established in the EPA. Second, local and regional stakeholders must be consulted before restoration programs are developed. And finally, in conjunction with said stakeholders, projects must be prioritized and fulfill one of the 4 sub-goals mentioned on the previous slide. Efforts to restore the bay do not start with H.R. 610. Many NGOs, governmental and private organizations, indigenous tribes, and so on have worked for years to improve the bay's overall quality. For example, the San Francisco Estuary Partnership, established under the Clean Water Act, has restored nearly 30,000 acres of floodplains over the last roughly 30 years. However, a coordinated effort is often lacking, and that is something that this bill and our program design hope to address directly. So there's been a lot of buildup, but let's finally get into the program design. There are basically 3 overarching components. The first establishes a centralized program office that oversees project coordination and assesses project priorities. The second takes consulting with stakeholders further by requiring the new office to work directly with established partners in the bay to build upon their existing restoration efforts. And finally, while existing efforts are crucial, part of ensuring an equitable restoration is making sure local and underprivileged communities are involved in the recovery process. Therefore, the third component establishes an independent grant project program where non-established stakeholders can request funding for historically overlooked or underfunded projects. Now, before choosing this program design, we spent a lot of time deliberating on whether we should go with a more EPA-directed model or a community-driven approach. The EPA-directed model would establish a program office where they would be the sole decision makers, and only a small portion of the program would be communicating with the local community. Alternatively, the community-driven approach would rely solely on proposals from local stakeholders to determine which projects to pursue. We ended up seeing the benefits of both programs and decided to move forward with our current program design, a negotiated model of sorts. This framework combines the strengths of both models into one. This program design will provide a foundation for the bay's restoration. Creating a centralized program office provides the oversight to coordinate the restoration effort in the bay. By partnering with existing organizations, we do not have to start from scratch. Instead, we use their existing knowledge and efforts in the bay to create feasible objectives, metrics, and baselines. We'll look at their successful efforts and other efforts that could be improved upon further. This is key, as establishing metrics and benchmarks is the only way to track progress and improve. Startup costs can often be expensive and time-consuming. However, working with these established partners will cut down on costs and needed time. And by doubling down on many of the existing efforts, we ensure program consistency, thereby reducing the friction that can be accompanied by the introduction of a new bill. We expect these benefits to help kickstart the program's restoration efforts, and to provide the Bay with as much of the $25 million as possible right away. The funding of independent projects guarantees communication with the local community. The program director may reassess all programs and funding on an annual basis, providing flexibility to local stakeholders as new and pressing local issues may need funding. And finally, by working with established organizations and funding local independent projects, the program is accountably addressing issues in the Bay. Our hope is that this feature helps to create an equitable restoration. Next, we'll be devising an organizational plan, a budget, a performance management structure, and a master calendar, all of which are crucial to the successful implementation of our bill. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll very happily take any of your questions now.
First off, thank you so much for the great presentation. I just have a question. Could you please just tell me more about why is there a lack of coordination between different stakeholders?
I'm sorry, the last part cut off. Did you say between stakeholders?
Yeah, why is there a lack of coordination between different stakeholders?
Sure. That's a good question, and again, our bill addresses that directly. A lot of these partners, while doing great work in the Bay, are not operating with one another. That's just because they're different organizations, NGOs, private organizations, tribes, and so our hope is that this bill can provide that oversight and coordination that, while has been effective, can still be improved upon. Thank you for that question.
Hi. I have a question about the centralized office. Do you imagine it to be its like own freestanding entity, or is it going to be like within the scope of the regional office of the EPA in San Francisco?
That's a good question. It will be under the regional office.
Excellent presentation. I'm curious what you perceive the breakdown between the pre-established projects and the sort of local community projects grants, like what the resources will be for each.
Right. I think, first of all, that's going to change on an annual basis. For example, right now, there's a spill in the Bay, and this would be a perfect time for funding to possibly shift more to that local community, making sure that it's cleaned up in an equitable fashion. So while I don't have a percentage breakdown, part of our program design provides that flexibility to kind of go back and forth, talk to those established partners, and see where we can go from there.
Thank you very much.
So normally, in pre-pandemic times, we would take a break and have coffee. We're not allowed to do that, so we're going to go directly into the second briefing and take a break between the second and third. So let me introduce our second speaker, who is Caleb Smith, and the project that he is working on is the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator Act. And for those of you who are wondering, this class begins at 9 a.m. Caleb.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking our faculty advisor, Dr. Stephen Cohen, my task output team, Yaritza Anguiano and Alexa Lorillard, and the rest of my team for all of their work so far in this semester. So I'd like to start with a brief overview of the presentation. I will go into the purpose, mandates, and structure of our bill, its underlying principles, green banks and their financial tools, as well as the project horizon, case study, program design, our SWOT analysis of our program design, and next steps. So our bill will establish the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator, which will establish it as a nonprofit green bank with 30-year charter, and over the course of that time, it will have $100 billion with which it can work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, thereby mitigating the impacts of climate change. So the core mandates of the Accelerator are that it will mobilize private capital into renewable energy, establish new green banks at the state level, and prioritize 40% of those investments to climate impacted communities. This overall will ease our transition to an affordable, clean energy economy for all. So to walk you through the organizational structure of the Accelerator, at the top is the board of directors, which is composed of 7 members. The committees will have advisory, investment, risk management, and audit responsibilities. And oversight capacity will come from the Department of Energy, as well as reports to the president and relevant congressional committees. Likewise, the Government Accountability Office will conduct audits. So at its core, the equitable treatment of community, workers, and ecosystems is the priority of the Accelerator. The range of strategies and structures it will use will have to be varied to meet all of its objectives. So for example, private partnerships will be used to kickstart new projects. Flexible risk tolerance will be an approach to expand potential opportunities. Capital recycling will make a resourceful use of existing public assets, and national guidelines will be crucial to making sure there's a unified baseline for all environmental justice projects. So just to walk everyone through the financial tools of the green banks, many of these tools are in place with regular banks as well. And I should note that these tools are used on a discretionary basis depending on macroeconomic conditions. But I'll go into a little bit more detail for each one. So private investing is a way to directly infuse projects with funding regardless of private capital interests. And grants are the one exception where it's primarily used on a smaller scale, particularly for projects that are more mission focused and are not prioritizing profit in their structure. So things like a community level active transport campaign might benefit from a grant. Loans are a way of debt financing, which basically means that the Accelerator and the borrowing entity would agree on interest rate and a contract term over which the borrower would pay back the Accelerator, ensuring longevity for the green bank. And this would be most likely used for an organization that's rapidly growing, so things like solar organizations or wind power. And lastly, loan guarantees are a tool to mitigate risk in the eyes of private investors. So the Accelerator would do this by signing on to take responsibility for any missed payments that the entity would sign on for with a private bank for other loans. So this might be used when the project is deemed more financially risky to private investors. So this schematic should guide your thinking in terms of the project types that the Accelerator will fund. Moving up the y-axis, the projects become more financially risky, and as you move from white to green, they become larger in scale. So they range from local, low risk to things like, from community solar to things like CO2 direct air capture systems at the federal level. So keep this in mind, this will be relevant later. Our case study takes us to Australia. The Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which was established in 2012. It has similar mandates to the Accelerator, and it was also an unprecedented investment in clean energy for Australia. While both the Accelerator and the CEFC operate on both the large-scale and small-scale projects, the difference is that the Accelerator will have our environmental justice mandate where the CFC does not. But we can see that it was effective in advancing renewable energy technologies, and it uses some of the same financial tools. So ours is a two-pronged model. 60 billion would be allocated to large-scale federal investments, which would lean more on the financially risky side, more nascent technologies, and then $40 billion, again, the 40% investment mandate, would be focused on establishing state and local green banks serving environmental justice communities. So this is our analysis of our program design. It allows for a high degree of flexibility in those larger scale projects, and for the community level projects, it allows for community stakeholders to have a higher degree of engagement and stake in their projects. Weaknesses are that we would have extremely limited capacity to invest in the middle scale market. So things like a utility scale wind farm might be one of the things that slips through the cracks. However, this is a sector of the market that's already seeing a fair amount of private investment, and we expect that that will continue to grow. Opportunities are that we can continue to take away lessons learned and best practices from other national green banks, and we also are able to support existing state green banks with the Accelerator. Threats are that there is a high operational burden on the Accelerator staff. So we anticipate some of these administrative challenges to look like the need for clarifying grants and loan eligibility for both federal and community scale projects. The Accelerator casts an extremely broad net in terms of project types, so the restrictions have to be pretty narrow and tight to attract the best suited opportunities. There's also a high opportunity cost for Accelerator staff, basically just meaning that staff will be spread fairly thin, so some promising and valuable projects we won't be able to pursue. And lastly, attracting expertise on a wide array of project types will be essential because that is actually in our organizational contracting and staffing plan, which will go into more detail on how to overcome these organizational challenges. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for the great presentation. I had a question about how this bill differs from the green banks that are currently proposed in the $3.5 trillion budget bill that's winding its way through Congress right now.
Thank you. I'm not as familiar with the details of the other green banks, but I don't know if anyone else wants to add to this, but from my understanding, I would think that it would be the scale and that specific 40% carve out for environmental justice communities. Would anyone else from my team want to chime in on that, or would you agree? All right.
Yeah, Caleb, you're totally right. It's mostly the 40% carve out for environmental justice communities that's different. And then also the scale of the bill. The infrastructure bill allocates, I think it was $27.5 billion to a federal green bank, and there isn't any of the same legislative language about environmental justice or about the state and local green bank carve outs.
Thank you, Jordan. I saw Molly.
Hi. Great job, Caleb. Thank you. So that 40% carve out, that's designed in the bill, correct? That's not your, okay.
Yes.
Do you feel like that's sufficient? How do you feel like that's going to be evaluated? Like, how is the success of that 40% going to be evaluated?
That's a good question. I think it will come down to how quickly the projects are able to actually start making an impact and tracking greenhouse gas reductions. But we'll go more into detail into the performance management and metrics side of that later on in the semester.
Thank you for your presentation. So you'd mentioned that some of those middle tier projects might slip through the cracks. I was hoping you could expand a bit on why that might be.
Sure. So the middle scale projects would be functioning basically on a different, it wouldn't be the priority within our program design. So while they might still be something that we could consider, that wouldn't be the focus of the kinds of projects that we'd be looking for. And as I mentioned, there is already a wide range of different opportunities that the Accelerator staff would be staffed with taking on. So it's just an issue of time management for the Accelerator staff. If they broaden their scope to, if it was a three-prong model and we just don't miss anything, there would actually be much more dysfunction on every level, I think. So, yeah.
Hi, I have a question about the slide with the different risks. Did you? Oh yeah, I'll let you go there first. This one, yeah. Did you set these risks, or are these general industry understandings of where these risks lie for different projects? How did you discern what was a high and low risk for each of these?
So Jordan has been kind of our finance czar because that's been his experience so far. So we kind of trusted his research and knowledge on this. I don't know if you want to go into more detail about how you came up with this schematic.
Yeah, it's just general market knowledge. These were kind of how we thought about things when I was working on these kinds of issues in the private sector. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we are going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll resume with our next briefing. So so after 2 spectacular briefings, I don't really want to put too much pressure on you, but we're going to hear from Meredith Spector, who is going to speak to us about the Break Free from Plastic bill that's advised by Professor Hill. Please.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. Good morning. I'm Meredith Spector, and today I'll be presenting the program design for a key component of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act of 2021. Thank you to my whole team for their tireless effort and advisor, Adrian Hill. Today's presentation will cover the plastics problem, the legislative solution, program objectives and design, and strategic outcomes and how we'll achieve those results. So why do we need a break free from plastic? The simple answer is that the US creates the most plastic waste per capita of any country in the world. You might think, well, that's okay as long as I recycle everything that I use. Unfortunately, of that waste created, less than 10% is collected for domestic recycling. Another 50% is exported to countries where it's generally mismanaged. The purpose of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is to spotlight plastic pollution as a national crisis with negative environmental and health effects. Almost every stage of the plastic life cycle creates harmful greenhouse gas emissions, soil and water contamination, toxins that leach into the environment and bioaccumulate in wildlife, and air pollution from fossil fuel extraction that disproportionately harms low-income communities and communities of color. Current waste management procedures exacerbate this, since landfills and processing facilities are generally located in socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. This is an ambitious bill that will impact the daily lives of most Americans and residents in this country. It will impact the manufacture of some of our most ubiquitous goods and transform the way that consumers interact with recyclable and single-use materials. The Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act tackles these problems by mandating a program of extended producer responsibility. Extended producer responsibility, known as EPR, is a policy approach that takes the burden of end-of-life management off of consumers and places it back on producers, basically making the polluters pay. The 4 central objectives here can be viewed through the lenses of environmental, economic, and social goals. The first one is to prevent pollution and litter from plastic. The second is to fund and encourage sustainable design. The third is to empower local communities through outreach and education. And the fourth is to reduce negative health outcomes and environmental effects. So this sounds pretty great, right? As residents, we'd love to increase climate resilience and pay less for it, but how are we actually going to do this? The answer is through an EPR program with strong governance and partnerships with municipal and community stakeholders. The Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act explicitly mandates many requirements, which is a little unusual for this kind of legislation, which only highlights their importance to its implementation. And I'll just run through a couple of those. So some of the program essentials are to establish producer responsibility organizations as 501c3 nonprofits. They'll be organized according to product category determined by the Environmental Protection Agency and an advisory committee of diverse stakeholders. The program also requires comprehensive evaluation through rigorous reporting and auditing. And each producer responsibility organization will need to submit a product stewardship plan that will detail how the producer responsibility organization will carry out all of its tasks. Environmental justice is always also stipulated in the bill by ensuring rigorous monitoring of frontline communities and emphasizing equity in access and engagement of socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. Since the bill lays out these main requirements, our program design focuses on the discretionary elements left open for interpretation. These discretionary elements can be framed as questions. The first one we want to address is, what will be the extent of governance and oversight? This is very important because these are the activities that will create the program and let it exist. We will create a new division of the EPA called the Plastic Pollution Program. This is needed because of the broad scope of how many collaborating entities will be affected. The Plastic Pollution Program will be originally housed under the EPA Office of Resources Conservation and Recovery, but in the longer term will develop into its own branch. We'll also create a central agency packaging registry, which will quantify and standardize data of covered products and producers. No such repository yet exists in the United States, but in other countries has been seen as vital to the success of such a program because, as we know, what gets measured gets done. Producer responsibility organizations will be funded by membership fees from producers. So how will these be assessed and what will they cover? Again, the scope here is very large. So the fees will be graduated based on the type of material produced and the amount produced annually. This sounds like it could get pretty expensive. And the answer is yes, that's right, but we're providing maximum coverage here. So the membership fees will cover administrative costs like daily operations and staffing, waste management, collection, and cleanup, including improving existing technology and infrastructure, and grants for research and development, encouraging design for the environment, which encourages producers to think at the beginning of their process what the impacts might be all along the life cycle. Finally, there's a spectrum of how EPR can be enacted, specifically for waste management. The extremes on this spectrum are full or partial opt-in, which will define the interaction between private and public entities. Through benchmarking, we've decided that the best version for the United States is municipal reimbursement with full regional opt-in. This means while the producer responsibility organizations are financially responsible, they will rely on municipalities to continue to use their existing infrastructure to carry out their regionally diverse waste management needs. Once again, putting this financial burden on the producers will incentivize those producers to start designing out waste for a less costly end-of-life waste management. So at the beginning, I framed the plastics problem through 3 lenses: economic, social, and environmental. We'll also use these lenses to assess the program's success. A successful economic outcome will address plastic waste management market failure and incentivize less production in the first place. A successful social outcome will ensure access and convenience for underserved communities and include diverse stakeholder voices in implementation strategies. A successful environmental outcome will standardize targets for decreasing pollution and litter and boost compliance and enforcement. Success of the EPR program will require harmonious intersection of those 3 pillars. When plastic cannot be eliminated, advancing recycling technology will keep useful resources out of the landfill and reduce the need for new extraction. Economic incentives or penalties will help ensure reaching the environmental goals and ultimately lead to the social goals of reducing health effects and making recycling and composting convenient and preferred and equitable. As the US rebuilds from ongoing health, economic, and climate crises, we can do better to implement extended producer responsibility in order to systemically reform the negative impacts of plastic production and those most vulnerable to it. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
I had a question about recycling in municipalities. So I understand that the idea is that basically these producer responsibility organizations are going to pay like municipalities to continue doing waste collection. I understand the bill really wants to encourage more recycling, but a lot of times municipalities don't recycle because it's expensive to implement, even though it's feasible. And so I'm wondering, like, if these organizations, which are basically representing companies, and they want to keep their costs low, they might actually be tempted to like recycle less because that's actually the cheaper option. So what is the oversight to actually encourage more recycling?
Well, they won't be allowed to recycle less because there are specific performance targets implicit in the bill. So that's why there's maximum membership fee for municipal reimbursement. that pressure should be off of the municipalities because they won't be paying for it. And also, it's not just about recycling and composting. There's really a big part of this bill that is aimed at reducing waste in the first place.
Meredith, thank you for the presentation. I have a question with respect to your breakdown of membership fees. So there was administrative costs and then research and grants. And my question is, of a certain budget, is there a specific percentage that goes to, let's say, administrative costs, which, does the bill explicitly say no more than, let's say, 5% or 10% goes to administrative costs, or is that decided along the way?
So that is not specifically stated, which is why it's one of the discretionary elements we wanted to discuss, and we're continuing to discuss that, and we'll get into it further in the budget and implementation.
Great presentation. Thanks. I just have a question about your words. I have a question about a previous presentation that your group gave and how it relates to the new EPA office that you guys are hoping to establish. In, I think, your political context presentation, you guys talked about how a lot of independent and private actors, such as waste management or other companies responsible for recycling, see a lot of risk with the concept of EPR. And I was wondering how you guys anticipate the partnership between this new office and your opposition and what that might look like, and also the challenges that might create downstream in establishing EPR.
The EPA, that's a great question. The EPA is really in the picture for governance and oversight because we're talking about so many companies here. Like if you're talking about all the covered plastic products, that could be, I mean, there are like possibly hundreds of thousands of companies in the US, so how many producer responsibility organizations will there be? That's exactly why we chose this municipal reimbursement structure, because, can you restate the first part of your question? Sorry.
Yeah, it got really wordy really fast, but the gist of it is, how do you see the new office that you guys plan on implementing in the EPA engaging with opposition in the waste management industry?
Okay, got it. So again, what really is helping ameliorate some of those challenges is the fact that there's still this municipal waste management inclusion, because when you do full opt-in, which would be the producer responsibility organizations creating their own outside waste management, that leads to monopolies and local facilities losing out. This keeps that competition, and it also encourages community engagement. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much. Another excellent presentation. What an impressive group. We're going to go right into our next briefing, which is the group that was advised by Professor Palmer, and it's on the Climate Stewardship Act of 2021. And this is Megan Hort.
Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Ort, and today I'll be presenting on behalf of the Climate Stewardship Act Workshop Group, discussing our program design. I'd like to give a quick thank you to our output team members, Leanna, Molly, and Rosie, as well as the entire team, and our faculty advisor, Dr. Palmer. So, the Climate Stewardship Act of 2021, introduced to Congress this year by Senator Cory Booker, seeks to address the issue of global anthropogenic climate change. In the US, climate change exacerbates other national and local issues that disproportionately impact low-income communities, indigenous nations, and communities of color. For example, the increasing frequency and severity of wildfires in the American West and the urban heat island effect. The Climate Stewardship Act proposes nature-based solutions to these issues by incentivizing certain land management practices in farms, forests, and wetlands. For this semester, we have chosen to focus on Title II, which addresses forests. Title II increases funding for a number of existing reforestation programs and creates several new programs with the intent of dramatically increasing the carbon sequestration potential of American forests while improving their resilience to the effects of climate change. Most notably, there will be a change in funding to the Reforestation Trust Fund from $30 million annually to $5.5 billion annually, which is an 18,000% increase. Title II also takes strides to address injustice in the U.S., from inequitable tree cover in urban areas and racial disparities in employment, especially after COVID-19. Overall, the bill calls for 1.7 billion trees to be planted by 2030, including 100 million in urban areas. To provide some political background for this bill, on the left are some environmental and indigenous forestry groups that endorsed a similar version of the Climate Stewardship Act in 2019, as well as some groups who have publicly expressed support this year. Since the 2021 iteration has yet to receive any public hearings, no groups have come out directly to oppose the bill, but because of its financial size, potential opposition may come from deficit hawk legislators and groups that oppose increased federal spending on climate change mitigation, like the ones listed on the right. We don't expect for this bill to pass in its entirety, but certain components could be adopted into other legislation. Considering that the current makeup of Congress contains a Democratic majority, elements may be incorporated into the upcoming reconciliation bill, which only requires a simple majority to pass in the Senate. The Climate Stewardship Act does contain several politically popular ideas, such as financially incentivizing voluntary land management practices as opposed to a top-down regulatory approach, as well as stimulating job creation. For these reasons, we have chosen to design and simulate implementation for Title II's new job creation program, the Climate Stewardship Corps. As outlined in Section 206 of Title II, the Climate Stewardship Corps will be established by the USDA Forest Service in consultation with the Department of the Interior. This program is modeled after Franklin Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s and 40s, but incorporates an added emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It simultaneously addresses the environmental justice concerns and revitalizes the forestry workforce by recruiting young people from low-income and indigenous communities, as well as communities of color, and providing them with skill training and career development in environmental restoration and conservation. The legislation specifies that Corps membership is limited to 2 years and guarantees housing accommodations while in the Corps, fair compensation, and job placement assistance after the Corps program. The legislation also mandates that the Corps will perform at least 20% of the federal forest and wetland restoration projects outlined in the bill between 2021 and 2025, and 40% of the projects starting in 2026 and each subsequent year. We have identified 3 areas of discretion in the bill for which program design is needed: administration, post-Corps job placement, and program evaluation. I will begin with the administration portion of our program. Here is our flow chart designed to illustrate the administrative duties for the Climate Stewardship Corps. The Washington office of the Department of Agriculture's Forest Service, shown on the left, will be responsible for allocating funding and setting employment targets for the regional Forest Service offices in the center. These targets will be based on the unique contexts within each region. Once the regions have been assigned their targets and provided funding, the regional offices will oversee and coordinate with local NGOs, shown on the right, who will carry out the bulk of the on-the-ground personnel administration, such as outreach, communications, recruitment and hiring, and project and human resource management, including payroll and benefits and performance reviews. Finally, the responsibility would then shift back to the Regional Forest Service offices to assign workers to their on-the-ground reforestation projects and provide specialized on-site training and housing once they arrive. We felt that this public-nonprofit partnership design would be best to fulfill the administrative needs for the program by providing the benefits of an established federal organizational structure while also utilizing the specialized partnerships with NGOs. The USDA Forest Service is best positioned to prioritize the funds and the workforce on a national level, and also coordinate projects on interstate lands as well as federal land projects in national forests, national parks, and lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. On the other hand, the local NGOs are better equipped for community outreach and personnel management and can improve employment access for people who haven't historically worked with and benefited from the Forest Service in the past. Next up, in our design, post-cord job placement assistance. We have chosen to utilize an existing program run by the Department of Labor and the USDA Forest Service called the Job Corps. The Job Corps will work with Stewardship Corps graduates to build an individualized job placement plan and connect them with employers in the nonprofit and private sectors as well as careers within government. The Job Corps then supports each individual for a full year after they gain employment. We chose this option because a crucial aspect of the Stewardship Corps is that members will be able to join the forestry industry in a more permanent role upon completing the program. The success of this element is essential in order to address the dwindling workforce in the forestry industry, which is struggling to replace mature workers with an infusion of skilled young foresters. A successful Stewardship Corps will also ensure that the benefits of this massive job placement program go to populations that have been historically marginalized and therefore underemployed. Though expanding the Job Corps will be labor and resource intensive, the program has proven to be highly effective for long-term employment and has been shown to positively impact earnings. And finally, we have decided that program evaluation will be conducted on an annual basis by the Government Accountability Office, or the GAO. The GAO is an independent, nonpartisan agency that evaluates and advises on government spending. The GAO will evaluate the Climate Stewardship Corps' success based on key performance and DEI metrics. For example, the percentage of participants with forestry or related jobs after completing the Corps within 1, 5, and 10 years, the demographic of Corps members in comparison to the regional makeup, and the effectiveness of training in preparing members for participation in reforestation projects. We chose this option because the GAO is less likely to be biased about the results than the USDA Forest Service. Additionally, because the GAO is a government agency, they may be particularly critical to ensure that the government funds are used as efficiently as possible and can advise on regarding reallocation. The primary drawback of this option is that the GAO might be less familiar with the Stewardship Corps' projects and may need to create additional roles to support program evaluation, as their specialty is in operational and financial management. However, we feel that the benefits of accountability, integrity, and reliability outweigh this drawback. The design choices presented here aim to best serve the goals of the Climate Stewardship Act and its new program, the Climate Stewardship Corps. With diversity, equity, and inclusion at the forefront of implementation, this program design will provide skills, training, and career development for its participants. And the efforts of the Stewardship Corps will ultimately support the broader goals of Title II of the Act, addressing the global climate crisis with proven land management practices that will improve carbon sequestration and climate resilience in American forests. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great presentation, Megan. I was wondering if you could delve deeper into why you chose to focus on Title II forests And why not the agricultural or the wetland part of the bill?
Yes, good question. So you asked why we chose to focus on the stewardship core itself. Right, so this is a huge bill. Last semester we covered the entire bill, agriculture, forests, and wetlands, and for this semester we decided to focus just on forests because it's so massive. And even within Title II, there's 4 new programs, but the stewardship core we all were very attracted to because of the explicit DEI elements written into the bill to prioritize hiring for marginalized communities. But also in our political analysis output, we found that this type of program is very politically viable at this time. Polling shows that there's a lot of political appetite to create a sort of civilian conservation corps revitalization. So yeah, that's why we chose to hone in on this program.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. You did a great job. I just wanted to ask how the CSC would navigate creating a program that manages to provide a wide range of experiences for core participants, given that forest land is not, equally distributed. So some folks may be coming from an urban environment and other states that don't have as much abundant forest land. So could you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, so that definitely played into our design for the allocation. Yeah, so forestry the forests are definitely more in the American West, so more funding and workforce will be going there. And that was also a concern of ours in terms of supporting the core members once they've been hired, which is why we allocated NGOs to be in charge of the hiring as well as like continual HR throughout the core, so that if people are traveling to new areas, they will still have support from that local NGO that hired them initially. Does that kind of answer your question? Thank you.
Hi, Megan. Great presentation. I'm just wondering how this plan differs from that of the Biden administration's plan for the Civilian Climate Corps.
Right. So Biden has a plan that's very similar. It's almost the same, I think, which just kind of speaks to the political appetite. It's very much in the political ether. I don't know the exact details of Biden's plan, but I do think his version is a bit more broad. So the Stewardship Corps focuses only on land management, and Biden's plan might also include energy, like solar installation. But yeah, at the core, I do think they're kind of similar in wanting to create jobs specifically for underserved communities and paying them a fair wage and increasing access.
Awesome presentation, Megan. I was curious about the portion of the evaluation metrics that includes the percentage of participants who have forestry-related jobs in the future. I'm curious if you could describe a little bit more kind of the thought process that went into putting that into the plan, and I guess if the statistics look, aren't up to par with what the program managers would expect, if there are any kind of mitigation measures for that.
I'm sorry, could you just clarify that?
Yeah, sorry. So just for context, I'm not sure how many forestry jobs there currently are, so I'm wondering if you have a pretty large program, what percentage of people realistically are going to be in forest management maybe 10 years down the road, especially given how many career switches there are just in general in every field. So I'm curious kind of what happens if what would count as a success under that metric, and then what happens if the program is deemed not successful? Like, what are the improvement metrics or measures that could be enacted?
Right, I see your point. Yeah, we're just starting to have those discussions on program evaluation and viability 10 years down the line, which is why we included related jobs. If anybody from the evaluation wants to speak to this, that'll be definitely a part of our later outputs, figuring out what metrics can be applied and what the targets will be. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Very interesting presentation. For those of you who don't know, the CCC during the New Deal actually took a lot of people from cities all over the country and brought them all mainly to the West, although here in New York, parks like Riverside Park and Morningside Park were renovated, and Riverside Park was actually built by WPA and CCC workers who literally went upstate and quarried rocks. Those stones you see on the walls at Riverside Park were literally carried from upstate New York to make the park. So it was, there were 400,000 workers involved in it at its peak. So it is a very interesting political issue. The other issue that was raised about jobs I thought was interesting, because if you plant 1 billion trees, I have a feeling there'll be a lot more forestry jobs down the road. So we'll see about that. But in any case, very interesting presentation, and so far really excellent, everybody. So let's take a break before our last one, and then we'll do our final midterm briefing. So the fifth project, advised by Professor Rosen, is the Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021. Chandana Yelker is our presenter. And if you're ready, let's take it away.
Am I audible? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So good morning. I'm Chandana, and I'll be presenting the midterm briefing on behalf of the workshop group on HR 5 and 6, Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021. Firstly, I would like to thank our advisor, Professor Rosen, my output team, Anika and Anupama, and the rest of our workshop group. So today we'll be going over the problem of environmental justice that the bill is addressing, the objectives of HR 5 and 6, the program design option that our group has chosen, and finally a summary. So HR 5 and 6 is addressing the issue of environmental justice, and the bill defines an environmental justice community as a community with significant representation of communities of color, low-income communities, or tribal and indigenous communities that experiences or is at a risk of experiencing higher or more adverse human health or environmental effects as compared to other communities. In the United States, the environmental justice communities have historically faced a disproportionate impact of environmental hazards. So this can be seen from the graph here that it represents the percentage of pollution exposure to the environmental justice communities. As you can see, Latin Americans are exposed to 63% more pollution than they produce, and Black Americans are exposed to 56% more pollution than they produce. And this is in comparison to non-Hispanic white Americans who are exposed to 17% less pollution than they produce. This problem is only aggravated by the lack of a comprehensive database identifying environmental justice communities. There are several national and state-specific databases such as the Census, CDC, etc. But they exist independently and in a scattered manner, because of which it is very difficult to use them to identify all of the EJ communities that exist across the United States. But with the existing efforts that have been taken place, the EPA, through its Environmental Justice Program, has awarded more than $29 million to 1,400 community-based organizations, tribal governments, and Native American organizations. But there are so many neglected communities still awaiting federal aid. And these are the issues that the bill is trying to address. So to get a context of the bill, HR 5 and 6, Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021, was introduced by Cory Bush in January of this year. It was referred to the Committee on Energy and Commerce and Natural Resources and the Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change. And the objectives of the bill are to form a mapping committee that consists of 28 federal agencies who will each be responsible to collect data pertaining to their departments. For example, the Department of Health and Human Services can provide data pertaining to childhood leukemia, rate of lead exposure, etc. The work of this committee will be based on the feedback received from local stakeholders like environmental justice communities and organizations. And the committee itself would be headed by the EPA. And another objective of the bill is to form a mapping tool that will be used to identify all the environmental justice communities in the US. And this will involve aggregating the data collected by the mapping committee on several socio-economic and environmental indicators, and would also entail development of a data repository to store all the data that is collected. In addition to this, a bill has allocated a funding of $20 million for implementation in the first 2 fiscal years of 2021 and 2022, and for the subsequent 3 years, it is $18 million, with the aim being to incentivize funding for the environmental justice communities that are being identified. On the whole, the implementation in the first year after the enactment of the bill would entail formation of a committee, development of a methodology for creation of the mapping tool, development of a methodology for identifying and addressing data gaps, which would again end in a formation of the data repository. Now let us look at the program design option that our group has chosen. Initially, the program designs that we developed were a political urgency approach, a data-driven approach, and a procedural equity approach. And our group has chosen the procedural equity approach because it is highly focused on community-based engagement to ensure inclusion of all environmental justice communities in the national database. So the procedural equity approach has a hiring strategy that focuses on both in-house and outsourced workforce, and it places a special emphasis on GIS specialists, that is Geographic Information System specialists, who are pivotal for the creation of the mapping tool, as well as DEI, that is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion contractors. The structure in this approach would be concurrent in such a way that the mapping committee would work alongside an advisory council, with the advisory council not just having a consulting role, but a managerial role in the entire decision-making process. And the committee responsibility on the whole would be to develop the mapping tool with the approval of the advisory council. Now here is a brief representation of the organizational structure when it comes to the procedural equity approach. As mentioned earlier, the implementation body would be headed by the EPA. So the EPA in its administrative role will coordinate the work between the mapping committee and the advisory council. The mapping committee, as mentioned earlier again, is responsible for data collection and mapping that will be carried out by the 28 federal agencies involved. And this mapping will be based on using DI contractors and GIS specialists. On the other hand, the advisory council will be made up of 50% members who are representatives of environmental justice communities. And this council will direct the implementation step for data collection and identification of environmental justice communities by working alongside and closely with the mapping committee. So the main implementation steps when it comes to this bill are data collection and resource allocation. So when it comes to data collection, the procedural equity approach utilizes a community-based participatory research method to ensure that all the environmental justice communities are included in the national database. On the other hand, resource allocation in this approach would ensure that the advisory committee will direct the funding allocation to ensure that the most pressing concerns receive the utmost funding. So just like any other approach, the procedural equity approach also has some pros and cons. One of the major advantages of this approach is that it is the most equitable to the environmental justice communities, mainly because of the extent of their involvement in the creation of the mapping tool. For example, EJ Screen is an EPA tool to identify the environmental justice communities, but it has 11 environmental and 6 demographic indicators. But the problem is that the data is only updated once in 3 years, and also it does not have granular data when it comes to the rural areas. So we believe that using a community-based engagement approach will overcome such barriers. Another advantage of this approach is that this approach provides an important role for the advisory council. This will ensure that their experiential input can be used to overcome and close the gaps that exist in the current databases. Another advantage of this approach is that it can help establish trust of the environmental justice communities and ensure proper reparations. On the other hand, this approach has one of the major disadvantages of being most cost and time intensive. This is because a community-based engagement requires immense input of time, money, and labor. Another drawback is that finalizing and obtaining a consensus on the methodology of developing a mapping tool as well as a methodology for identifying and addressing data gaps can be very difficult, mainly because of the number of stakeholders involved in the decision-making process. Finally, to summarize, the procedural equity approach and our bill will ensure that the environmental justice communities have easy access to data to organize and fight for justice. This is because empowerment of the environmental justice communities are integrated into every aspect of this program design option. So, in continuation, next week we will be focusing on organizational contracting and staffing plan. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Hey, Chandana. Really awesome job. My question goes back to the beginning of your presentation when you talked about how certain racial categories or groups pollute more than they take in, which is a very bad way of summarizing what you said. But how do they define the polluters? Will it be like a company with a majority, let's say, white board, or is it based on like a CEO? I was just curious how that breakdown went about.
Okay, so first of all, identifying the environmental justice communities itself and defining them is itself not an easy process because it is not defined on the whole. So there's a definition given by this bill. If you look up somewhere else, there'll be another definition, right? So that itself is a difficult process, but I think on the whole, the way they define that is by the location that you are at, and I think the income levels and your spending, so all of that would sort of give an estimation of what you're using, and then it could relate to how much you would be polluting. And like you also mentioned, I think when it comes to the CEOs and like the big organizations who are placed maybe near the locations where these communities are housed, again, that would again show that these sort of like organizations who mostly employ maybe the majority population would be polluting the area where the minority population is located. But I do not have a definite answer to that yet. Thank you.
I had a question about the mix of like just combining new data or like existing data, because obviously like some of this stuff will just come from the Census Bureau or the Health and Human Development Department, and then some of it you suggested was going to be like new data collection. So what do you think that breakdown is between like we're just trying to like centralize existing data versus we need additional data? And then a follow-up question is like who are going to be responsible for that new data collection? Like what organization and who's going to be performing that work?
Yeah. So first of all, the breakdown would depend on the past data and the new data that would be collected. Would, again, like I mentioned, the first year would be mainly focused on identifying where there's a data gap, right? So there you will be able to identify what's already existing and what is then required. And this approach mainly is focusing on a community-based participatory method approach, right? So that is because we have seen that in the current databases that exist, there is ample data, but again, there is again a lot of drawbacks because it is not very inclusive. So what is already collected is maybe based on census, CDC, etc., and several agencies that are part of the federal government. But then we also want to sort of include outsourced workforce, sort of like have an outreach program and go to the ground level and sort of like have a participatory method to sort of like talk to the people and then gather data. So that is also a focus of this program. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Really fantastic job. My question is just asking for a little clarification on the organizational flow chart. So it seemed to show that information is flowing into the EPA from both the mapping committee and the advisory council. So can you clarify in that case what the specific managerial tasks of the advisory council would be?
Yeah, so the whole of the implementation body is headed by the EPA, but in this approach, we are giving a very high role to the advisory council, and obviously they will be sort of pivotal in directing who should be contacted, how is the data collection to be implemented, and how do we contact the community members and get that sort of input, right? So that is the sort of information that will be flown from the council to the EPA too. But that is the main role. So we want to ensure that this council does not just have a consultancy role where it's like they give some recommendation, but that is not heard of or not implemented, but sort of making sure that whatever they say is taken into account, not just taken into account, but implemented. But the whole of the structure would be sort of like, the main head would be the EPA anyway. So. Yeah.
Oh, that was the question. Okay. Do you have a question? Oh.
Yeah, I'm just wondering how you plan on integrating stories and interviews and testimonials into your larger map.
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Oh, sorry. Well, first, great presentation. I forgot that part, so redo. But my question was how you guys plan on integrating stories and testimonials and interviews and surveys that you do in your local projects with the larger map.
Okay. So that design is not yet developed. So we have only thought of this, and then I think in the future weeks we'll have a more concrete plan. But then the idea is that if you start talking to communities, you will know who has been already included in the database and who has not. And I think that's a very complex procedure in itself and will take time, which is why that is one of the most disadvantageous aspect of this program design. But we want to go ahead with it because even if it is difficult, it can produce very good results. So, but then we still have to see how to implement that. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, first, all excellent presentations. So let's give our briefers another round of applause. So what I'd like to do at this point is bring you back again to where we started, which was looking at the science of these programs, which is what we spent the summer doing, and now taking these bills and looking at them again in terms of what piece of this can we actually get started with. So you go from a fundamental understanding of what is the issue, what's the problem that we're addressing, what's the solution, what is the scientific basis of it. And so again, all of these environmental problems have a scientific element. What I thought was really interesting today was that all of these programs also have a diversity, equity, inclusion, and access element to it, which I thought was brought out in each of these briefings, and I applaud you for that as well. And I mean, the final brief, this last midterm briefing, the whole bill is about that, but I mean, all of these bills, all of these environmental programs have been, the groups have focused some attention on these issues, which I think is something, if you look at the midterm briefings a decade ago, you would not have seen. And you can look at them on our website if you really want to. What I see here in the group is real progress in trying to get your arms around these bills and really understand what are these programs about. And you know, the phrase that's often used is cutting problems down to size, because you can't do everything at once. The forestry group certainly had a humongous bill to deal with, but all of these bills have huge elements, and you have to start somewhere. So the second half of the semester is going to focus it even more narrowly about startup. You know, a lot of people are interested in entrepreneurship and business startup, and that's an emerging field of study. But government program startup is also what the second half of the semester is about. So how do these programs relate to what's already there? How do they relate to not just what's there in the federal government, but at the state and local level and at the community level? How do you really make this real? And so the second half of the semester is really going to be focused on those very practical day-to-day issues that every public policy analyst needs to think about as you think about what's feasible and what's real. You know, we've seen, and just to give you a couple of examples of the Biden administration, an approach to immigration that is not working at the border because nobody's paying attention to the details. A withdrawal from Afghanistan, which has been seen as a fiasco because those management organizational issues were not focused on. Lots of discussion in Washington about the policies and the values and the politics, not enough about on-the-ground operational issues that make things real. And that's what the second half of the semester is about. And frankly, if you don't get to that, none of the other stuff matters. And so in order to make policy real, we have to focus on these really prosaic operational details that are not fun and are not, all that intellectually, path-breaking. This is really old-fashioned, boots on the ground. What are we going to do day to day to make this happen? And this is also why sometimes what is promised in Washington, people in communities never see, because the design itself doesn't think about the reality, and somebody's not paying attention to the day-to-day. The last example I'll give you is when Obamacare started and the website crashed. Okay, what undermines your credibility more than a detail like that? And so, again, that's what we're going to be focusing on the second half of the semester. And it may seem like this is prosaic stuff, because it is, but this is the most important thing I think you're going to be doing while you're in this program, is focusing on those issues and hopefully learning something. So again, congratulations. These program designs were thrilling to hear. Really excellent presentations, uniformly excellent. And I congratulate you all. And I guess your reward from that is muffins? Is that what we... Say it again? If you want to stay, Stephanie's going to take some photos of groups, if you want, on her camera, while I go and steal the muffins. So thank you.